You're listening to an Ono Media podcast. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Into the Dark podcast. I'm your host, Payton Morin. Thank you so much for being here. If you are watching on YouTube, please subscribe, turn on notifications, leave a comment below. It just helps engage with the show, give it out to new people. If you are listening on podcast and can leave a 5-star review, that would be amazing. I know I ask you guys every single time, but I probably will not stop anytime soon. So thanks for being patient. Jumping straight into my 10 seconds. I've been talking about this on my social media, so if you follow me over there, you know, but I binge watched Adolescence. It is a show on Netflix that's actually, I think, made by UK Netflix. It is about a 13-year-old boy who murders one of his classmates, a girl, and the entire show is just about sexism and the way that boys are brought up, and that if we're not careful about it, violence against women will persist even at such a young age, and that your perfect child who you love can literally become a nightmare so fast, just because of the culture and what's acceptable. And I thought that it was such a good show. I have so many thoughts on just every single little detail, like just the tiniest little things that showed these like microaggressions of what leads to violence against women. And I don't know, I thought it was so good. So if you haven't watched it, Adolescence on Netflix, it's not a whodunit. It's not even a murder mystery. We know who did it. It's just about the complexities of murder. And something that's really cool about it is every single episode is actually shot in one take. So they would shoot the episode multiple times, but it's one take the entire way through. So the camera's just constantly moving. If they're changing scenes, you're driving in the car with them. It's so cool to actually watch, and keeping that in mind as well. All right. That being said, let's jump into today's episode. Trigger warning, this episode includes discussions of sexual assault, including the sexual assault of minors and suicide. So please listen with care. Does fate exist? It's one of those questions that we'll never be able to answer for sure. Some people fully believe that they have a destiny. Everything that happens to them was meant to happen. They might think their partner is a soulmate, and when they face challenges, it's because a higher power gave them an obstacle that they needed to overcome. And then others think there's no fate or destiny or higher power. Sometimes things just happen due to random chance. And it's impossible to say which side of the debate is correct. We'll never know for sure if fate is real. But if it does exist, it has never been on Stephen Morin's side. Stephen was born on February 19th, 1951. And from the very beginning of his life, it was difficult. According to Stephen, his mother was sexually abusive against his brother and another underage boy that Stephen knew. Now, his mom was never charged or convicted for those alleged crimes. So we don't know many details about the abuse or if it for sure happened. But according to Stephen, that situation left him feeling very disturbed as he came of age. And after growing up in those circumstances at home, it should be no surprise that Stephen would lash out. By the time he was 14 years old in 1965, he was regularly stealing cars, getting in high-speed chases with the police. And when he eventually got caught, he was sent to a juvenile detention facility called the Florida School for Boys. Now, I'm just going to get this out of the way. The Florida School for Boys was a terrible place. It was horribly understaffed, especially back in the 90s. Caseworkers were stretched too thin, so even the people who cared about their work weren't always able to support the boys at the school the way they needed to. And not all of the staffers were caring. Some of them were violent. It later came out that when some boys misbehaved in this school, they would be chained to the wall. Now, over the years, at least 55 teenage boys died during their stay at the Florida school, and they were buried in unmarked graves right there on the school grounds. So Needless to say, Stephen was desperate to get out of this facility, and he got his chance at escape when he was 14 years old. His dad came to visit, so almost right when he got in. And while no one was watching, Stephen stole his dad's car and drove off. Now, as soon as the officials realized what had happened, they called the police. They chased Stephen down, even after he crashed his father's car and stole another one. And then he did the same thing, stealing a third car after he wrecked the second. And when he crashed the third car, the police finally apprehended him. And they decided, rather than investigate the school for its abuses, they were going to prosecute Stephen for the escape and for the run of car thefts. He was found guilty and sentenced to 5 years at the Florida State Prison, where he was incarcerated along with adults. Keep in mind, he was just 15 years old. According to Stephen, during his first year in prison, at just 15, he was sexually assaulted. His attacker was a fellow prison inmate. And again, those allegations were never proven, but it's clear that this was a very harrowing time for Stephen. After 2 years, Stephen was released on parole, but he was still deeply disturbed after everything he had been through at this point. And now, he wasn't getting any guidance, supervision, or mental health treatment. So Stephen just kept committing these crimes. But he didn't stick to nonviolent car thefts like he'd done before. As Stephen got older, he began abusing drugs, and even more concerning, his behavior escalated to violence. Stephen was physically abusive against his girlfriend. On one occasion, just to mess with her, he actually killed her beloved pet cat and then mailed the cat's body to her at work, which is a terrible thing to do. Now, for some reason, she stays with him, and the two of them actually eventually get married, only to divorce pretty quickly afterward. And that wasn't even the worst of it. One day in 1976, when Stephen was 25 years old, he tricked his younger sister's 14-year-old friend into coming over to his house. Now, this girl's identity hasn't been made public. She was a minor. We only know the broad strokes of what happened to her. But we do know that this 14-year-old girl came to his house. Stephen tied her up and gagged her and assaulted her both sexually and physically for 6 hours. Now, the entire time, he had the TV on with the volume cranked so no one would hear her scream. The girl was so terrified and in so much pain that she actually thought about jumping out of the window to try and get away. And she didn't know if she'd survive that fall, but even death seemed preferable to what she was experiencing. Instead of killing herself, the girl actually waited until Stephen took her gag off, and then in the kindest voice she could muster, she said, "You just need someone to care about you. You're just hurt." And to her shock, her words seemed to move Stephen. According to him, his whole life, he had really never been shown kindness. He wasn't used to people trying to understand him or empathize with him. So he decided to let the girl live. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel bad for Stephen or excuse his behavior. This is just how this story has been explained in the media. So Stephen lets her live. He skips town to avoid another arrest. Now, even though the girl survived, obviously her road to recovery was long, and according to sources to this day, she really hasn't moved past the trauma. For years, she self-medicated with illegal drugs. She had serious issues with self-confidence. Stephen basically destroyed this girl's life. And unfortunately, he wasn't done abducting, sexually assaulting, and torturing women. In fact, after his attack on the 14-year-old girl, he kept repeating the crime with other victims, but with one major difference. He escalated. Stephen would not let his next victims live, and he became a serial killer. And sadly, to this day, we don't know exactly how many murders he committed. He was too good at covering his tracks. Stephen was always on the move. For almost his entire adult life, he was drifting from town to town, never staying anywhere for long. And each time he'd get to a new city, he'd befriend a young woman, scam her out of her money, and then brutally murder her. And afterward, he'd hide the body well enough that it wouldn't be discovered until days or weeks later. So by the time the police found each victim and opened a murder investigation, Stephen would have already moved on. He also would change his name and forged various identity documents for himself to make it harder for anyone to track his movements. And this strategy worked really well for him. Stephen was an expert at both tricking people and disguising himself. Not everyone who has a hard childhood turns into a serial killer, but Stephen is one of those horrific people. For example, in 1980, an 18-year-old woman named Susan Bellote went missing in Las Vegas. She was on her way home from work, walking a route she'd taken dozens of times before, when she vanished without a trace. Her body was found in Vegas months later, on May 26th, and it was so badly deteriorated that it took the police until the end of the year to identify her. All they knew for 6 long months after finding her body was that she was a Jane Doe who had been strangled to death. And once they finally learned her name, the bodies in and around Las Vegas were already piling up. At least 3 women had been found in the desert, but they hadn't all been killed the same way. Susan was strangled, another woman was shot in the head, and a third died when someone smashed her skull with a rock. So it took a while for the police to realize that these murders could have been linked. And then it took them even longer to realize that all 3 of these women had known Stephen, especially since Stephen used a fake name while he was committing these murders in Vegas. So each step of the investigation was slow, and the delays only brought Stephen more time to take more lives. But here's an especially disturbing detail about Susan's case. Stephen was living an entire life while also murdering women. And Susan went missing on the day that Stephen's son was born. So Stephen's newlywed wife was in labor in the hospital alone while Stephen was reportedly kidnapping and committing a murder. It wasn't the girlfriend with the cat, by the way. This was a different woman who he went on to marry. It probably won't surprise you to hear that he and that wife separated pretty soon after the baby was born. But I want to talk about another one of his alleged victims in Las Vegas, a 19-year-old woman named Cheryl Davis. Before her death, Stephen knew Cheryl because he dated her. She didn't know that he was married at first. In fact, during their short relationship, Cheryl really trusted him. She let him into her life. That included introducing him to her friends, like Sarah Payton. And then after about 6 weeks, Cheryl learned that her boyfriend Stephen was married. She broke up with him. And afterward, Stephen allegedly murdered Cheryl. She just became another one of his victims. He changed his name and gave himself a makeover and then began stalking Sarah. This is the friend that Cheryl had told about Stephen. Now, you'd think Sarah would be suspicious. She might recognize Stephen, knowing that he'd been hanging around Cheryl before her murder and realize he was potentially the killer. But Sarah didn't recognize him. Instead, for the second time in her life, she let Stephen get close to her. Eventually, he began repeatedly asking her out on dates, and each time she declined, he would fly into a rage and threaten to kill her. Sometimes he called her on the phone, and Sarah could hear noises in the background. It sounded like while he was talking to her, he was in the process of maybe torturing or killing someone else. And this terrified Sarah. But she still didn't make the connection between Stephen and his current identity and the man who had been a part of Cheryl's life before her disappearance and murder. That's how good he was at hiding in plain sight, which is why he was able to get away with this when honestly he's being pretty sloppy. Now, before the police were able to figure out Stephen's identity, they actually dubbed him the Chameleon. I mean, he had almost everyone fooled. And on the rare occasion that he'd meet someone who was suspicious of him, Stephen knew exactly how to charm them. Take this story from Chris Clark. In 1981, Chris was 21 years old and he lived with his mother. And then one day, a stranger showed up on their front porch. He said he was new in town, he was looking for a place to live, and during the course of a brief conversation, that man charmed Chris's mother enough for her to agree to go on a date with him. The guy introduced himself as Ray, but of course, it was actually Stephen. Think about how scary this is. Stephen is just walking around, changing his identity, luring people in, and then literally killing them. Now, as soon as her son, Chris, met Stephen, he felt skeptical. For one thing, Chris is 21 and Stephen was only 30 years old. That made him just 9 years older than Chris and way too young to be dating Chris's mother. And on top of that, she had a long history of going out with guys who didn't treat her very well. So Chris just didn't trust his mother's instincts, especially since she got serious with Stephen very quickly without really taking the time to get to know him. Well, once Stephen realized that Chris didn't like him, he turned up the charm and he looked for opportunities to win this boy over. Stephen helped Chris get a new job and save up money to move out of his mother's house. And then one time, Chris was helping his mother with some home repairs. He was on a ladder that started to slip out beneath him. And just before Chris could take a nasty fall, Stephen actually jumped in to help him. He didn't need to save Chris, but he did it anyway. Now, this wasn't enough to make Chris drop all of the suspicions he had about Stephen, but it was a step in that direction. Sometime after that, Stephen made plans to go on a road trip with Chris's mother. And he also convinced her to pay for the vacation herself, even though she needed to sell everything she owned to afford it. And this is his MO. Find a woman, charm the pants off of her, steal all her money, and then murder her. So while Stephen was preparing for this trip, Chris came over to visit one day. And he saw Stephen hanging carpet on the interior of his van. He was attaching it to the walls, the ceiling, the floor, everywhere. He was carpeting the interior of his van, or at least he was trying to. But the carpet was heavy, and Stephen was struggling to hold it in place while also trying to pin it down. So Chris hopped in to help him out. Now, he still didn't really like or trust Stephen, but it just seemed like a friendly thing to do. Now, afterward, the road trip began, and the entire time that they were traveling together, Stephen was acting different. On this road trip with Cheryl, he'd disappear for hours or days at a time. He never told his girlfriend where he was going or when he'd be back, but each time he turned up after one of those vanishing acts, he'd say that it was time to leave for the next stop on their road trip, like he was in a rush to get away. Now, Chris's mother had no idea what her young boyfriend Stephen was really up to, that he was actually using this road trip as an opportunity to kill women and then skip town before the bodies could be found, all on the dime of his girlfriend. She never imagined that she was dating a serial killer, but she did know he was sneaking around and lying, and this trip was not what she had expected it to be. It was enough for her to break up with Stephen and drive home alone. She had no idea how close she had been to a mass murderer. Not until 4 years later, when Stephen's crimes finally came to light. And when the news broke, Chris and his mother were both shaken, as you can imagine. Especially when Chris thought back on the day that he had helped Stephen attach the carpet to his van's walls and ceiling. That's when he realized he had probably been helping Stephen prepare the van for his later murders. He was basically soundproofing the vehicle. But how did Stephen even get caught? How did all of this come to light? By 1981, the police were finally putting the pieces together, at least some of them. They had linked Stephen to many of the different women who had been murdered, and they were starting to realize the disguises he had used, the ruses he had used, which aliases he had lived under, but they still hadn't found him yet. They knew who their suspect was, but this is a chameleon. So Stephen was living as a free man. In fact, at this point, he was staying in San Antonio, Texas, still just killing victims. The police didn't realize that yet, so there was no one stopping him from committing more murders. One day in December, he kidnapped a woman named Pamela Jackson. He tied her up, took her back to his hotel room, intending to torture and kill her later on. But in the meantime, as she was tied up in his hotel, he went out and found another victim. Now, given his history, it sounds like he got some kind of thrill out of drawing his crimes out, like making it last, getting multiple victims. That's why he would call while he already had one there. So while Pamela was in Stephen's room, he went down to a diner and tried to kidnap a different woman, Carrie Marie Scott. But before he could force Carrie into his car, her friend walked up and interrupted this attempted kidnapping. Now, in his rush to get away before anyone could call the police, Stephen shot Carrie and her friend. And sadly, Carrie died of her injuries. But the friend survived, and multiple people witnessed this shootout. It was very sloppy work. I mean, a daytime kidnapping when she had a friend with her. So they called the police and described what they'd seen. And once they learned what the shooter looked like, the investigator realized that Stephen Morin, this wanted, kind of notorious serial killer at this point, was now in San Antonio. And even better, they knew exactly where he was staying because one of the witnesses got Stephen's license plate number. Some officers found his car parked in the lot right outside of his hotel, so they knew he had to be staying there. Now, in no time, the police stormed the hotel and burst into his room. And I know this sounds like an episode of Criminal Minds, a serial killer who's on the run, murdering women, and then gets sloppy because he's escalating, and boom, police barge in and find Pamela still tied up and alive in this hotel room. But there's no sign of Stephen. Apparently, he had spotted the squad cars assembling in the parking lot, so before the officers could make it to his room, he had climbed out a hotel window. Now, I can only imagine how discouraging and frustrating this must have felt, to be so close to catching Stephen just for him to slip through their fingers. Either way, the investigators didn't want to let him get away, so they threw themselves into trying to answer one question. Where was Stephen? They needed to stop him before he moved to an entire different state and got to do this all over again. The answer was that Stephen left that hotel and was on his way to a local Kmart. This is just a grocery store. Specifically, he walked to the Kmart's parking lot and he began looking for a vehicle to steal. So he's here and his eyes fell on one woman who'd just walked out of Kmart with a cart full of Christmas presents. She was 30 years old, a Texas local with long blonde hair, brown eyes. Her name was Margie Palm. She was a mother of 2, and she was shopping for her family, and she had no idea that she was in danger, in part because she'd lived a pretty charmed life up until this point. You'll remember that I opened this episode by talking about fate, how some people seem to have bad things happen to them no matter what they do, and others just seem destined for perpetual good luck. Well, if Stephen was fated to have a rough childhood and then become a serial killer, Margie was someone who seemed to always have good luck on her side. She had a good life growing up. She'd never wanted for anything. She was your stereotypical Southern beauty queen. She was on the homecoming court at her high school. She was crowned the Sun Queen at a local festival. She got good grades until she graduated. I mean, Margie was smart, pretty, active in church, happily married, with a family. From the outside looking in, I mean, she has it all. Except on December 11th, 1981, when her luck finally stalled out. She'd just finished loading all of the presents into the back seats and trunk of her car. And that's when Stephen approached Margie with his gun drawn. Now, I want to mention here, Stephen could just go into hiding. Okay, he could just try to get out of this state, but he can't stop himself from finding a new victim. And it's going to be his downfall. So he ordered Margie to let him inside and then drive him around wherever he wanted to go. And if she refused, he would shoot her. So Margie did what she was told. Stephen climbed into the driver's seat and began rifling through her cassette collection, looking for a song he'd like to listen to. Again, this man was just caught in almost caught in a hotel room with a woman tied up after he had just shot 2 other women in a parking lot. And instead of running away, he's looking for a song to listen to while keeping someone hostage. He's cursing at her, threatening to kill her, and whining that it was unfair that she could afford a car full of Christmas presents when he had grown up with so little. And if you remember the beginning of the story, that was all from Stephen's point of view. He talks about his life in a very victim mindset. So Margie, in this time, decides to pray for Stephen's soul. She closes her eyes and asks God to remove the wicked forces that were making Stephen act the way he was. She even pressed her palm against his forehead in an attempt to cast out evil. And this is just the difference between Margie and Stephen. And shockingly, it worked. Stephen told Margie that he still planned to kidnap her because he needed her help getting away, but now because she had prayed for him, he promised not to hurt her. So for the time being, Margie was safe. And the whole situation ties back into the question I've been asking since this episode began. Did Stephen spare Margie simply because she was lucky? Or was some other force, destiny, fate, God, protecting her? There's also one other possibility. Margie saved herself by being kind and compassionate. I mean, Stephen kind of has a history of sparing women who treat him with kindness and understanding. If you remember his first victim, the 14-year-old girl, he spared her after she showed him empathy. And when Margie prayed for Stephen, she may have just won him over. It also probably helped that she tried to cast out his evil. In doing so, she basically told him that she didn't see him as a bad person, just someone who had something bad going on inside of him. According to Stephen, she's helping him feel seen and loved. Psychology. So now Stephen was treating Margie almost like they were friends. So they drove around talking about their lives. And I'm sure this was extremely weird for Margie and uncomfortable. But Stephen begins sharing the harrowing details about his difficult childhood. And Margie talks about her faith and what Jesus meant to her. And the more they chatted, the more Stephen almost seemed to let his guard down. Later on, he also stopped at a convenience store. Stephen let Margie go inside and pick up some beer, cigarettes, and the newspaper. He literally just waited in the car while Margie handled the shopping. Well, while Margie was grabbing the paper, she couldn't help but skim the front page headline, and it said the police were on the hunt for a mass murderer who was on the loose in San Antonio. Under the story was a picture of Stephen, and Margie is like, oh my gosh, the guy in my car is actually a serial killer. Of course, she already knew Stephen wasn't a safe person to be around. That was obvious enough from the fact that he had kidnapped her at gunpoint, but she'd had no idea that he was a wanted murderer. Now, she realized just how much danger she was in and had been in this entire time, except she doesn't say anything to the cashier. She knew Stephen was sitting right outside. And if he began to suspect that she was turning him in, he could come in with guns blazing or just take the car and run. So it seemed safer to her to say nothing and to walk back out to his car, which actually ended up being the right move because as it turned out, while she was in there reading the paper, seeing his picture, Stephen was in the car feeling paranoid. In particular, he remembered that Margie had a family and he realized they're probably worried that she's not home by now. So before they drove away, he actually marched her to a nearby phone booth with his gun drawn and said, call your husband, Bart, and tell him you're running late. So Margie had another shot at escape. She called Bart and tried to communicate with a secret message. She said, hey, I still haven't finished the Christmas shopping. She tells him she wasn't going to be home by the kids' bedtime, so Bart should put their son and daughter to sleep without her. Now, in their entire marriage, Margie had never missed putting her kids to bed, and she was positive that her husband Bart would hear her request for him to handle it and hopefully read between the lines and realize that something was definitely wrong. But her husband did not pick up on the subtext. He just thought that Margie was super excited for the holidays and had actually lost track of time. Basically, he took her request to put the kids to sleep at face value and didn't give it another thought. So Margie was on her own, which meant she had no choice but to get back into the car with Stephen and continue their drive. She went right back to reassuring him that God loved him and that he could be forgiven if he promised to never kill again. And at one point, Stephen actually shocked Margie. He told her that he was going to let her go, and just like she'd suggested, he was never going to kill anyone again. So Margie told Stephen to turn off the road they were on and drive in a different direction. She didn't know the area and wasn't headed anywhere in particular. She kind of was just saying whatever popped into her head, trying to act cooperative and hoping Stephen wouldn't change his mind. They kept wandering around for a while until they eventually found themselves at a bus stop. And it was almost enough to make you believe in fate. There was no way that Margie should have known that there was a bus station there. But somehow, she and Stephen drove right to it. So they get to this bus stop and she helps Stephen buy his ticket and set out on his path to a new life as his escape. And then she drove home. As a reminder, these were the days before cell phones. She didn't have any way of calling her husband right then to let him know what she had been through or why she was late. So imagine her surprise when she pulled up in front of her house and found it surrounded by police cars. So the police drive Margie back to the station to take her statement. It took some coaxing for her to open up because she was still afraid of Stephen and what he might do to her family if he learned that she went to the police. But eventually she told the police about Stephen's apparent change of heart. She explained he promised to live a better life and that she had put him on a bus. Since she was with him when he bought the ticket, she also knew exactly what city he was headed toward and when he was scheduled to arrive there. And thanks to Margie's tip, the police found Stephen right away, and he surrendered peacefully. So they finally captured this notorious serial killer, and he pleads guilty when he went to trial in April of 1982. That was the first of several trials he attended for his many murders. But during his sentencing hearing the first time around, Stephen argued that he should be given a lighter punishment because he had converted to Christianity. According to him, he was a changed man and he would never hurt anyone again, which was a very self-serving way of framing this situation. And unfortunately, there were signs that Stephen hadn't really changed. I mean, remember, he was nicknamed the Chameleon. He knew how to act trustworthy just long enough to get people to let their guards down, how to manipulate people. The truth was, at one point, some prison guards searched his cell and found fake IDs and razor blades. I mean, it kind of seems like he was going to break out and go on the run again. And despite the fact that he pled guilty to murders, Stephen refused to confess really any details or confess to additional murders. When the police asked him where the bodies were buried and begged for help so families could receive closure, Stephen just wouldn't do it. Doesn't really seem like the behavior from someone who's actually reformed. Plus, even if Stephen had changed, the judge still had to be fair to the victims, people who had been hurt and who deserved justice. The judge sentenced him to death in his first trial. And then the same thing happened at his second trial. Stephen says he's changed, said he was different, and he was still sentenced to be executed. In total, Stephen went to court to face murder charges 3 times. But there were a lot of murders he was never charged with, even though he was the top suspect. Eventually, the state realized it was pointless to keep trying him over and over because he was going to receive the death penalty every single time. Afterward, he never filed any appeals, which is very strange. He just seemed to accept his fate. But get this. While waiting for his death, Stephen stayed in touch with Margie. He would call her regularly to talk about God and his faith. And this is wild because Margie came to think of Stephen as a friend. He had kidnapped her. He had killed all of these people and caused so much pain. And while Margie still didn't think he should be free, she also didn't think that he should die. She hoped that somehow his execution would be overturned. But remember, Stephen's a manipulator. Margie visited Stephen in prison repeatedly. She lost count of how many trips she made to see him, but she estimated that it happened probably 15 times. Which is a lot given that Stephen was only in prison for about 3 years. He was scheduled to die by lethal injection on March 13th, 1985, when he was 34 years old. He asked Margie to be there for emotional support, but she decided not to come. The day was going to be very emotional for her too, and she thought it was important to prioritize her own health. And even though she wasn't there to watch Stephen die, she did visit him on the 12th, just one day before his execution. And the next day, when it was Stephen's time to die, he cheerfully walked into the chamber and let the prison guards strap him down to a gurney. But the doctors had a hard time finding a place to inject the deadly drugs. After years of substance abuse, Stephen's veins were collapsed. It took the medics 41 minutes to figure out how to give him a shot, and then another 11 minutes passed before the drugs kicked in and killed him. The entire procedure took nearly an hour. And he passed away just after midnight the next day on the 14th. Now, the whole time he was in the chamber waiting to die, Stephen had a huge smile. So even to the very end, it's impossible to say if Stephen had reformed or if this was just a scam or a coping mechanism. Margie was never sure. But that didn't stop other people from trying to project meaning onto the situation. For years, Hollywood producers and publishing companies approached her. They wanted to make books and movies about what had happened to her, but an oversimplified version of it. One where Stephen was an evil manipulator, or one where she saved herself through the power of prayer. But Margie didn't agree with either of those interpretations, so she refused to sell the rights to her story. Instead, in 2023, she gave an interview with Vanity Fair so she could set the record straight. Decades had passed since her abduction. She was now 72 years old. And in this interview, she said that she did not believe she had experienced a miracle. She didn't think God chose to save her that day. And her reasoning was that it would be disrespectful to Stephen's other victims to frame her story as some divine intervention. Margie didn't think God would let those other women die horribly only to step in and save her. She didn't deserve to live any more than the others did. Margie couldn't really explain why Stephen had spared her. It was luck, fate, a trick of psychology. But at the end of the day, some things in life kind of defy explanation. And that is the story of the serial killer, Stephen Morin. All right, you guys, thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I will see you next time as we go further into the dark together. Goodbye.